Good. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. How's life been?
Well, it's been rough, but
Oh, I never seen you last week.
I came for the
Oh, the chop.
right. Chunky and right before that.
Okay, that's like literally the only Boston Cup of this. Okay. What do you take this?
I'm taking calculus 270 and then history of ethics.
Okay. I didn't like calculus. So, you know, it's better than maritime one. It's like past classes and.
We'll probably start around
Yeah.
6 o'clock.
It's a lot.
Sounds good. Yeah.
It's much more.
I love the English part, the conceptual part. of calculus.
Yeah. So, yeah, I figured like once you get past all the crap with algebra and grid calc, it's much better. Really.
I
And ethics. Something like that.
yeah, I remember I told you I was gonna major in math as well, but it changed. I'm majoring in physics now.
Physics is really cool. And you're doing philosophy deal or
I'm still doing it.
double major. It's a cool combination. They actually go well together. Yes.
I'm still working on your philosophy degree.
Actually, I did PhD.
It's going on.
Yeah.
It's a common day.
Oh,
It's been since the break, but what you did, people from right in the line, so
Right now, I'm studying for my all of my.
how would you do this?
Yeah. So
Coming to an end
it's just
Very soon.
pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Because on top of everything.
Oh my gosh.
No.
Like all for me.
Neither am I. I'm trying to get there.
No, it's even worse than that. It's just really bad.
So, you know, we're
Never had a class like that. But
everyone
everyone
else
else
is a great conference.
Yeah, how did that go?
Amazing.
So everybody's been talking about Chomsky. So that's good. Were the student talks good too?
Yeah, they were pretty good. Yeah, we had kids. The university clubs, they really did such a great job. And,
First
talks were
unit
good.
was Athenian ethics.
All sorts of different
So
things.
going over.
Was it, so one person
the
went at a time?
and
That's it, they
Plato's
didn't have any,
Republic.
Yeah.
synchronous.
Yeah, 100% of the time.
That was
Other
my
countries,
focus.
right,
And then second unit was Christian ethics. So we went over like biblical ethics. And then the third
And there was a good turnout?
medieval.
Especially for the Chomsky.
Yeah, I imagine people would come around. Getting out at 9 o'clock in the morning, whenever it started.
Yeah.
Starts at 10.
Intellectual interpretation.
Well, for me, yeah, I would have done it, but the tickets, I got very confused with the tickets, and he was
I'm
not
reading.
in contact with me quickly enough to tell me that I didn't need one.
What is
So
God
I wasn't gonna
command
I thought
someone to not love
Just
God?
miscommunication.
And
But yeah, that's the only reason why.
okay or not.
Yeah, it's like.
Yeah.
I apologize.
No, yeah, what happened with that? What happened with that?
It's like.
Yeah.
So it
It's
was,
weird.
it was my responsibility
Because I like
backwards
or
here.
objectively is the person that everyone.
No, I knew that. I knew that. Cindy told me in the hall
Can you actually order
that,
something?
oh, you couldn't get
Choose
tickets.
something that's
That,
bad.
that's okay.
Basically,
There's something
that's
happening
like-
with the tickets.
He's basically
You're still gonna
saying
be able to
you
come.
can order someone
then-
to.
She didn't give me the official email,
God
but
can
this was,
order
when it was
someone
going
to
down
not
until
love
Saturday
God.
morning, when I was already gone, I just had a really.
But
really
they-
good Saturday.
He gets away
So
with
I
it
was
by
already gone by
saying
the time I
that
heard it, but she tried getting
he's-
to me early.
that person is
We
loving
expected I would be able to.
God's will, God's command, by
I got the
obeying it.
email, right.
So he kind of gets away with saying that, and then he's also saying,
But I
well,
had a student.
if you didn't obey God's command, you really wouldn't.
Yeah.
love him.
Yeah.
So he kind of fudges
I don't know
it.
what he talked about.
But you obey,
I know he was nervous about it,
then,
it sounds like it went okay.
Yeah.
yeah,
it's
this thing's like.
Yeah, it's awesome. We need
Yeah.
more.
Yeah, it looks like
Next
we're
year,
talking about
semi-annual,
something
is it
like
gonna be an
that.
annual thing?
That's bad. Like,
Yeah, we should do it.
but this-
Yeah, our goal is
Well,
to
you guys
kind of be,
No,
social
no,
club.
about it.
Or no.
That's right, no, you start well, I mean, the profession isn't very social profession.
It is very much.
The work that's done by top, you know.
We
Yeah.
took his class.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, good.
So, it's kind of interesting to see. It was a good class.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of fun, but yeah, I was there a lot.
Say,
Yeah, it was
So how
like,
many online
that was
students
like
do you
a
have?
disaster. I don't really know.
Oh, we do get
I
like
kind of even.
3 to 4 online people who
Position in
engage.
Los Angeles, like.
It depends
maybe I
on,
shouldn't
like,
be
Who
giving
what
this.
the schedule
Who is it? I teach one of online classes. I don't know.
A little bit.
Really?
I mean, I
really?
really
I
like,
forget the
I
name.
still like it. It's just like, man, that class was rough.
Who are they? And Kari Green is one of them.
Hey.
Shani Mulaic is another. Micah.
Yep.
Joel, I think. Yeah.
Good.
Okay.
Hey, how you doing?
So what is that? Do you have a Facebook?
Looking
Sure, I do. It should be.
Thanks for coming.
PHILIP.
I'll start at 6:20. I'm not.
Ooh, that's not me. It's, should be 1L. Oh, that's probably it.
Oh, are you set about, I messaged Emily.
Yeah, the weird squirrel thing.
Form the email, so she can get reimbursed. I don't know if she followed up with it, but it's not too
It's a
late.
lot of.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, so I think what happened was, so she has so she earned like a fellowship, like a scholarship thing that pays for all of her expenses.
Oh.
That's what she was, yeah. So like, so it went on her account, I guess it's, but that's like unconfirmed, because it just disappeared, so it's weird. So she definitely look into it. But,
So, we're gonna get, oh, that's pizza. Hi, pizza.
well, you just
Perfect.
got us pizza.
Sweet, I'll be right there. Thank you so much.
Can you
Bye.
see it?
Once I come back, we're gonna start.
Which online classes are you teaching? Just some like.
Philosophy of science, I
Mhm.
do online almost every semester.
Uh-huh.
It's the same as the face-to-face one, just with pre-recorded videos.
Yeah,
Yeah, you saw it. The pre-recorded videos. Is,
of course,
Yeah,
of course.
Stop using those. But yeah, I'm teaching that, and right now that's the only online class I have. Sometimes I'll do symbolic logic. Sometimes I do like a 400 level class. I did philosophy of time and time travel last fall,
Mm.
and that was actually available to on-ground students. All of my 400 level classes are available to on-ground as well as online.
Oh.
So if you think that your fall semester is going to be really lax at the start for the first 6 weeks, take a 400 level course with me. It's online, it's available to on-ground students. It's just super intense for 6 weeks, and then the rest of the semester is
Interesting.
pretty lax. So it's a lot of intensity up front, but yeah, they're fun, and they're not offered on ground. Otherwise, I'm the only one that does metaphysics and philosophy of time. So
Didn't you take philosophy of time?
Yeah,
philosophy of time and time travel.
I did
So was it super intense
yeah,
to do it? Yeah.
Yeah, it was rough.
Well, I mean, because that class, the time travel class, it's supposed to be on time travel, but in order to get that literature, you need to be familiar with the basics of the philosophy of time.
Yeah.
And there is no 300 level philosophy of time class, which I'm trying to change. So I needed to like front load all of that. But here's the A
That-
theory and B theory stuff I had to do, basically compressing 2 courses into one and
Yeah.
allowing you to kind of pick and choose what you wanted to learn in the second half on your own.
Actually, yeah, I would have liked the initial part to be like the whole, like, a whole class.
You
'cause-
could do a whole class, because it's just scratching the surface. We didn't really talk about the movie
Yeah.
Spotlight View, we didn't talk about issues about becoming. So I mean, the first part of the class really is just the first half of the 300 level class. The
Yeah.
second half, which would be something other than time travel. But it would be less intense, because there's a lot of time to travel
Yeah.
material. There'd probably be maybe 4 or 5 readings in addition to that. So yeah, it was intense, but yeah, good stuff. Yeah, I'm glad to. What's your name?
Philip.
Philip?
Eli.
Oh, nice. Oh, yes, okay. Yeah, no, I remember you guys. Awesome. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
This is something else I'm up to besides time travel stuff.
Oh, weren't you working on like working on some like existence paper thing?
Yeah, I had a paper on how to express existence claims, how to say time is real, that's the paper the paper on existence is the paper on time.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I have a specific way of, well, I challenge the popular idea that to say that time exists is to say that there are times, like T1, T2, T3, like, you see that in classes, like, at T1, this happens, at T2.
Yeah.
So I deny that to say that time exists is to say that there are these things we call times. We have to commit to the reality of time using a different way of committing ourselves. So it's a neat paper, but it's not finished for one. I've kind of trailed off and I'm struggling to figure out how I want to end it. The beginning's good, but yeah, I don't know where I want to go with it. So that's kind of taking a back seat. And I just got really excited about all this self-reference stuff. You'll see, like the thing that's been passed around. I made that as a joke for some of the professors here, and it turned into a paper. So
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that was the same one I think I saw on your boards. It's just like this whole branch.
Yeah.
Is
No,
that a
that's
different
called
one?
set theory.
That's what I was. Okay, that's
Yeah, no, what I'm trying to do on that whiteboard that will never be erased, because I'll never get around to finishing it, is I'm trying to show how that you can get. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show how to unify the mathematical space or mathematical realm with the physical realm by saying that everything in math is just a study of the part-whole relation. So in the physical world, there are chairs, and there are parts of chairs, and in the mathematical world, there are sets and subsets, and many people think that there's a huge difference between those two things, that the way that you construct the mathematical universe is fundamentally different from the way that you construct the physical universe, and I deny that. I say that there's a way of conceiving of the part-whole relation that makes them the same, and so we now can unify these two universes into a single hierarchy, that all has the same fundamental root in instantiating empty property, like instantiate some property or another. Just iterate that over and over again, and you get all of the structure that you need for mathematics, and coincidentally, and very surprisingly, you get all the structure that you need for a physical world as well. So it's bizarre. But yeah, but there's so many ways you can go from that one picture, that one hierarchy, that I never want to erase that, because there's like 4 or 5 pages of the filter on that.
Oh, that's something I'm really
Yeah,
excited
there's
for.
a huge project on that. I'll never finish it. It's nothing. But yeah, it's
That's exciting.
a neat paper. Yeah, I like that. I should do that one.
Awesome.
And with that, we're gonna start. Hello, welcome to the Undergraduate Philosophy Club. My name is Nathaniel Pierce. Thank you so much for coming. I know that it's kind of getting pretty rushed as we're approaching the end of the semester. So thanks for coming out. We do have pizza, as you can see, and I'm taking advantage of that. We also have some free merchandise. So represent. Before we welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Pellos, who is a professor here, we're going to go through some announcements real quick. You guys all know this, you know that. These are some cool conference and journal opportunities. We just had our amazing conference. Hard to beat, but there are kind of 3 more opportunities. So you can jot them down if you want, or you can come and ask me for more details. I can give you these. Also similar are some opportunities for kind of workshops around the U.S. and even some in Europe. So kind of our goal as a club is to promote your success. And so there's some here. There's one in Michigan. There's another one in Great Britain, University of Birmingham. ASC does have some funding opportunities for you. And there's another one in Colorado. These are all deadlines that haven't passed yet, so you can apply. And then there's one on Rutgers that I'm pretty interested in. So you can see the deadlines coming up. So if you're interested in any of these, or just hit me up, and I will send you the links.
Wait, when was the Rutgers one? Was that over the summer?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
So it's good. And with that being said, you're welcome up. I guess we,
All right, so I'm calling this, this talk, self-reference, the good, the bad, and the ugly. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna present a few cases of self-reference. Self-reference, and as you see the cloud over there, that's what a cloud is, what it's supposed to look like. A sentence is self-referential if and only if it either implicitly or explicitly refers to itself. Okay, so there are some good cases of self-reference. For example, a good case of self-reference is this sentence has 22 letters. That reports something true about itself. If you count them up, these are numerals, not letters, but if you count them up, there should be 22. And if I made a mistake there, then it's false. Still, it's a good case of self-reference. The sentence is either true or false. It attempts to report something about the world. In fact, it attempts to report something about itself. Here's another good case of self-reference. This one. I'm the one who wrote this very sentence. Clearly, it's true. It refers to itself. It also refers to me. But you can't deny that this is an okay case of self-reference. Here's another one, a little bit more controversial. But suppose we consider this, underneath the good, we consider this a list of sentences. Here's another self-referential sentence. If every sentence on this list of the good is true, then this sentence is true. So here we have a sentence that's referring to itself and saying, if all of the sentences in this list are true, including me, including this one, then I'm true, then this sentence is true. Perfectly mundane, okay case of self-reference. There are bad cases of self-reference. Bad cases of self-reference include the liar paradox, the main adversary of truth. The liar paradox says, this sentence is false. Or this sentence is not true. It's reporting its own falsehood. If the sentence is true, then it's false. If the sentence is false, then it's true. Contradiction. So there's something wrong with this sentence. It's a pathological sentence. It's a bad sentence. Something is going on. Here's another pathological, bad, self-referential sentence. It's called the truth teller. This sentence is true. That sentence doesn't lead to contradiction. If I say that the sentence is true, then there's no contradiction there. It's just true. And if that sentence is not true, then it's just false. It's a false sentence. So that sentence can be true or false. The problem, and what makes it pathological and a bad case of self-reference, is that there's no way to determine the truth value of the sentence. Grammatically, it's okay. It seems to say something about itself, but there's no way that we can possibly determine the truth value of the sentence. Here's another bad case of self-reference. It's Curry's paradox, or what I like to call the prove anything paradox. Probably my favorite thing. That is the prove anything paradox. Goes like this. If this sentence is true, then insert any sentence you want there. Give me a sentence, a ridiculous sentence, something that's obviously false, and I'll prove it to be true.
Unicorns exist.
Unicorns exist? That's a good one. If only we could move this sentence over to this list then proving that would make me very happy. I would love it for unicorns. So if this sentence is true, then unicorns exist. I'm going to change up how I present this a little bit. So I want to show you why you can prove anything, why this is a bad case of self-reference. So why is query sentence bad? Well, consider the following inferential steps. Consider Leibniz law. Here's an inference that we all know is good. This should go on the good list, but it's not self-referential. So we'll just put it here. So here's my inference rules. So these are the rules of logic that I will apply in order to prove that unicorns exist. I'm going to generate a proof that unicorns exist. Here's one such rule. Leibniz law works like this. Anytime you've got an identity statement A equals B, and you know that A is true, say, or A is red, or whatever, you can validly conclude that B is true, or B is red, or whatever predicate you want to apply to the objects here. So Leibniz law. This is one of our rules. Here's another one. Modus ponens. Modus ponens works like this. Suppose you've got a conditional. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. Okay? So modus ponens is another one. We've got disquotation. Disquotation is when you take a sentence and you say, if a sentence is true, then you can just assert that sentence. For example, if P is true, then we can just write down P. So if the sentence snow is white is true, then snow is white. Okay? That's disquotation. Should be good. Relatedly, we've got quotation. Quotation works like this. Suppose you've got a claim like snow is white. We'll just say P. If we can assert P, then we can assert that P is true. This is quotation. I think, so is that 4? Do I need more than 4? I might have to add to this list as the proof goes on. I'm pretty sure that this will be enough. So what I want to do now, to start the proof, to prove that unicorns exist, let's start with a simple stipulation. Let's say that S, and this is something that I'm stipulating. Maybe I can stipulate to someone else on the board if you have a problem with me putting a number on it. So let's just say that. Premise 1, I have, by stipulation, S, that symbol, that variable designates the following sentence. If S is true, then unicorns exist. Okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make an assumption. Oh, here's one of my rules, conditional proof. If you assume something, if assuming P allows you to derive Q, then if P, then Q. So that is, if I make an assumption, and by making that assumption I can derive Q, then if it's the case that P, it's also the case that Q. This is my box, right? This will make it efficient. All right, so now let's assume that S is true. Okay, so this is just an assumption. Now, under this assumption, let's remind ourselves that S is identical to this string of symbols. S is identical to this sentence, which is clearly self-referential, because we're saying S equals, if this very sentence is true, then unicorns exist. So this is our self-referential sentence, and it's analogous to the Curry sentence over there, the list of the bad things. So assume that S is true. So S is identical to this string, so given Leibniz law, I'm allowed to do this. If S is true, then unicorns exist is true. If S is true, then I'm just applying Leibniz law. S equals this string. We know that S is true, so that string is true. That's all we've done here. Leibniz law, 1 and 2. 4. Disquotation. Okay. Disquotation allows me to take a sentence that I have quoted, followed by a truth predicate, and I can just drop the truth predicate and write down the contents of the quotation. Where did I get that? 3 plus disquotation. That's a little bit more legible. So now what do I have on lines 2 and 4 and modus ponens? Notice 2, I say, let's get rid of that. I assume S is true. And I've just derived that if S is true, then unicorns exist. According to modus ponens, I'm allowed to conclude that unicorns exist. I haven't proved that unicorns exist yet. So this is 2, 4 modus ponens. So what I've done is I've proved that unicorns exist under the assumption that S is true. So I haven't proved that unicorns exist. I've only proved that unicorns exist if S is true. So let's acknowledge that with conditional proof. If S is true, then unicorns exist. And this is lines 2 through 5, conditional proof. I've assumed P, this allowed me to derive Q, unicorns exist. So if this thing that led to the deriving of unicorns exist, then unicorns exist. And this is 2 through 5, conditional proof. So we can guess where we're going now. So now we're not in the scope of any assumptions here. This is just true. We've now shown, in a sense, that this sentence up here is true. How do we know that? Quotation. Given 6, I can take any sentence that I have written down, I can put quotes around it, and say of that quoted sentence that it's true. If S is true, then unicorns exist. If S is true, then unicorns exist, yep, is true. And this is 6 quotation. I've just taken this sentence here, thrown quotes around it, and said that it's true. But look at this. This is what we see up here. And this is identical to this. So if we say that this is true, we're saying this is true. That means through Leibniz law, this is true. So 1, we've got S equals that string up there. We've just affirmed down here that that string is true. So likewise, we can say that the S is true. The 2 things are identical, and one thing has a property, so is the other thing. That's essentially what it says. So, what do we have? We have S is true. And this comes from 7, or 1 in 7, 1, 7, sorry, 1, 7, Leibniz law. All right, but now that we've got S is true, and on line 6 we've got if S is true, then unicorns exist. We've got through modus ponens, unicorns exist. that mandates a few exclamation marks, and this comes from 6 and 8, modus ponens. A proof that unicorns exist. There's no assumptions active. This is just, as soon as we get to this line here, we're talking about the actual world. This, from lines 2 to 5, we're talking about some hypothetical world, some world where S is true. Well, it turns out we learn later on that S is true in the actual world, but if that's the case, then modus ponens gives us a proof of unicorn's existence. This is the proof anything paradox. You can put any sentence. You can put any sentence in here. You can put P and not P, it's raining and it's not raining. You can put something true there if you want, that's boring. You can put anything you want and you'll be able to construct a proof from rules that everybody knows and agrees to. Leibniz law, who denies that? Nobody. Disquotation, quotation, who denies these things? Some people actually deny these rules. People that are involved and really interested in self-reference are trying to explore different ways of blocking moves like this. Of course, Tarski, the guy that advocates the disquotational theory of truth, isn't going to like this. I think that isn't going to like the denial of those principles, but some people try. Modus ponens, can't get rid of that. That is the standard of all logic. Every logic work that's weighted in anything is it has to validate modus ponens. That's like the condition for getting a logic off the ground. Conditional proof, can't get rid of that either. Logic's needed. So really, if we're going to trace the problem, like we shouldn't be able to prove this. And so there's something wrong with this sentence up here. That's why I put it in the case of the man. So now I'm going to do case. I call it the ugly. Okay, and it's actually, it's kind of funny. It's a bad joke, so it's ugly in a sense. And it has a conclusion that's somewhat distasteful to some people. It's an argument against the existence of God. So it's ugly. But my question, the center of my research really in this paper is this ugly case of self-reference, does it belong here in the bad, or does it belong here in the good? If it belongs here in the good, then we've got an argument against the existence of God. Specifically, we have an argument against the possibility of omniscience, not really the argument against the existence of God. Oh, we might just say that, oh wait, I was wrong, God is not omniscient. You might say that and still preserve the existence of God. So that's what happens if the disappearing act goes in the good box. If it goes in the bad box, you really got to wonder why. Because as we'll see from the handout, the reasoning that goes into the disappearing act is a lot like this. And if it's a lot like this, then that suggests, by analogy, that it should belong over here. So let's see. Let's see what this disappearing act argument is all about. So I gave you a little handout. I'll read through it, and then I present the argument on the opposite side. I'll walk you through that too. Okay, here it goes. Late one night, while watching his favorite live TV trivia show, God became very angry. He was witness to what he took to be a grave injustice. For one of the show's contestants, we'll call him Saul, had been credited with 5 correct answers out of 5 on this trivia show. But as an omniscient entity who, by his very essence, knows every truth, God was well aware that only 3 of Saul's assertions were correct. So God's really upset about this, and it goes down to the set of the show in a flash of light. And he says, "Stop this nonsense," in a booming voice. And startles the studio audience, of course. But as the audience begins to settle down by what they're seeing here, this amazing scene that they're seeing, God calmly begins to explain his contention with the show's justice. He says, "Look, to begin, rest assured, most of the assertions that Saul makes today are true." But before he can finish his sentence, he finished the sentence, but before he can finish his thought, which consists of multiple sentences, Saul interrupts him and says, "You're a big liar." Now, of course, God's not a big liar. He's not angry at this interruption. He's not angry, but he looks like he's struck by panic. And he's not panicked because he's been exposed as a liar. Because, of course, the Almighty is no liar. So what Saul said there is false. So rather, the look of panic on God's face reflects his dreadful anticipation of what Saul is about to say next. Because Saul says, "You don't know that," namely, you don't know that most of what I say today is true. And with that sentence, as soon as the period is struck, when the exclamation is struck, God disappears into a puff of smoke, ceasing to exist. It's a bad joke. See, at that point, everybody's supposed to laugh. I once had a laugh when I gave the story to another talk. I got one very loud laugh, and the rest of the room was in stunned silence. So it is a bad joke, empirically speaking. But there's this question. So the reason why it's a bad joke is this weird thing happen. This weird thing happens. God disappears. There's a strange conversation about how many answers he's getting true, and it's not really clear what the connection is between God's disappearance and the answers on this trivia show. So here's the question: why does God disappear? Well, to figure out this answer, let's create a scorecard for Saul. And this scorecard is going to account for all the true things that he says, and it's going to account for all of the false things that he says. And this is going to help us figure out why God disappeared. So at the moment that God storms the set of the show, how many claims does it turn out that Saul got right? The judges credit 5 out of 5, but in fact, Saul got only 3 assertions correct, and 2 of them were wrong. So on the back, we see the scorecard, number of true assertions, 3 X's in that box, number of false assertions, 2. So then what happens in the story? God makes a claim. He says that most of what Saul says today is true. And then Saul immediately after calls him a liar. Now look what happens to Saul's scorecard when he calls God a liar. Suddenly we have 3 X's in the true box and 3 an equal number of X's in the false box. So, because God's surely not a liar, so surely the claim that you're a liar is false. So it belongs in the false box in the scorecard. But Saul doesn't stop there. He just keeps running on. He says something else. He says, you don't know that most of what I said today is true. All right. So here's an assertion. You don't know that most of what I said today is true. Is that assertion true or false? It's got to be one or the other. So let's suppose that it's false. If it's false, then we've got to modify the scorecard that looks like this. So in the very middle, you've got Saul's scorecard. If his claim, you don't know that most of what I said today is true, is false. So if that sentence is false, then the number of false assertions outweighs the number of true assertions. We have 4 X's in the false box and 3 assertions in the true box. So according to this hypothetical scorecard, God can't possibly know that most of what Saul says is true, since according to this scorecard, most of what Saul says is false. So God can't possibly know that most of what Saul said that day is true, because most of what he said is false. Okay, so what it turns out then, if that's right, then what Saul said must be true. It must be true that God doesn't know that most of what Saul says that day is true. And so the real scorecard then, after this thought that, what Saul said must in fact be true, and it must be true that God doesn't know that most of what he said is true. So the scorecard then looks like this. The number of true assertions is 4 X's, and the number of false assertions is 3 X's. Okay, so if the claim that you don't know that most of what I said today is true, then it turns out that the number of true assertions made that day is 4, and the number of false assertions is less than that, it's 3. And so from the scorecard, we see that most of what Saul says that day is in fact true, but at the same time, we just learned that God doesn't know that truth. This gives us an argument. Premise 1, there is a truth that God doesn't know. God doesn't know the truth that most of what Saul said that day is true. We just showed it. And as stated at the outset of the parable, God's existence, or at least in the story, God's existence depends on his omniscience. If God exists, then he knows all the truths. He's omniscient by his very essence at this point. But premise 1 and premise 2, plus, we don't have it up here, remotus tollens, another good inference, just entails that God doesn't exist. If God's existence depends on him knowing all the truths, but we've just shown that there's a truth that God doesn't know, then there's an argument that God doesn't exist. The question is, so we've got an argument that God doesn't exist. We've got an argument basically that omniscience is impossible. You can't know all of the truths. No matter who you are, not even God can know all the truths. Question, is that ugly, ugly conclusion bad? Or is it good?
Conclusion?
Yeah, the whole argument is the argument. So in this case, we've got self-reference, because we're talking about most of the assertions, and that very assertion is among the most being talked about. So in that case, is the sentence, So I guess the conclusion, well, it's can be kind of messy, depending on who you're talking to. But really, my interest isn't in religion here. I don't want to disprove God's existence. I want to find out whether or not the sentence, no one knows, or God doesn't know that most of what I said today is true. Is that sentence, that ugly sentence, is it bad or is it good?
It's bad,
It's bad. Why?
because you're not using the same reference in the two scenarios.
What do you mean?
So you claim God said something like, most of the assertions Saul made today are true, right?
Mhm.
What's the referent of that?
What do you mean reference?
Like,
The reference of assertion?
just, the fact that it's made
Uh-huh.
seems to imply that it's past tense, sentences that he's already uttered.
Oh, did I blow that? So most of what Saul says today is true. Did I slip with the past tense?
Even if you put it in the present tense, it seems to me that the implication, I think we do use the present tense in a way that seems to imply just past tenses, and I think that would be an interesting way to get out of it.
Maybe. So the idea is, God's claim doesn't continue on to the future. God's only talking about the past in this
The
case.
past and present, but at this point where Saul's two further claims are in view.
So what happens when Saul utters that last claim, because that's the one that does him in, really? Saul utters, most of what I said, you don't know that most of what I said today is true. Or you don't know that most of what I say today is true.
Well, then that would include a different set of sentences.
It includes a different set of sentences, so it's talking about sentences that God hadn't considered yet. Two of them, exactly, claim that you're a liar, and you don't know that most of what I said today is true. But so what? That's the sentence that gives rise to the problem. Not God can say whatever he wants. Saul is the one that says this offensive sentence, this ugly sentence that scares God away. Saul's the one that says, you don't know that most of what I said today is true. If that's true or if that's false, then God knows that most of what he said that day is true, but that can't be, because given the scorecard, if it's false, then it's false that most of what he said that day is true, so God can't know. So really, it's Saul's assertion that matters in this case, and he can go past tense if he wants, and he can continue saying false things all day if he wants. If he just says, you don't know that most of what I said at the show is true, including the sentence that I'm uttering now, that's enough to get the problem out of the way. Yeah, you don't need to have him match God's expression. That's just kind of a quirk of the way that I tell the story. But you're right to pick up on it. Other ideas? So you're a good company. Most people that I tell this to say that this is bad. But notice what we're doing in the argument is when I'm saying most of what I said today is true, we're just talking about a list of sentences. And here's a case of self-reference where the listing isn't a problem at all. If every sentence on this list is true, then so is this one. So if we're talking about self-reference as coming at the end of a list, which is exactly what's going on in the story, if this sentence is good, why isn't that one? You get the paradox though? Is that, you feel the force of that? Like there's something going on here. But I'm calling it a paradox. If it turns out that we put it over here, then it isn't a paradox at all. It's a proof of the impossibility of omniscience. If we put it over here, then it's a paradox and we need to diagnose it somehow. Either way, it's cool. So what's the problem? I have to admit, it's not entirely like this, but this is talking about if every sentence in this list is true, then this sentence is true. And this is talking about most, and there's this weird case where God puts himself in a position, and this is a comic caricature of God. Of course, God wouldn't put himself in this position if there is such an entity. But there's this weird position where exactly half of what Saul says is true, and it's that tightrope, it's that balancing act where what happens next depends entirely on what Saul says. So if Saul said something, anything else, pretty much any other sentence, any other false sentence, God would not have disappeared. He said any true sentence, sentence that would disappear. It just happens to be exactly that sentence that causes the problem. It's quirky, huh? So another question. What's wrong with this sentence? All I'm doing is I'm saying S is identical to this string of symbols. S is identical to the symbol I, followed by the symbol F, followed by a space, followed by the symbol S, followed by a space, and I can keep concatenating that one. So we face a puzzle here. We don't know what's going on in the disappearing act. But likewise, we think that this is bad, a bad sentence, but we struggle to say why. I don't know why.
I mean, I guess the only thing that I can think of is perhaps there's some sort of intension extension problem.
Uh-huh.
Where, you're using Leibniz's law in a way that sort of allows you to substitute the quotation of the sentence for the actual sentence.
Yeah, yeah.
And it seems almost like a creature with a heart, creature with a kidney problem in that, just because they're extensionally true doesn't mean that they have the same intention.
Good, yeah, that might be a solution. If the truth predicate or truth operator is intentional, and we're not allowed to substitute identicals within the scope of an intentional operator, like you point out with the heart and kidney problem, or just or more generally, I could believe that all triangles have three sides, while disbelieving that all triangles have three interior angles. I could believe one and not the other, but they're logically equivalent. They're not identical in that case, they're logically equivalent. So there are all these sorts of cases where you've got something like identity or like logical equivalence, and you can't do this substitution trick within the scope of an operator, like belief. Like I can believe that Mark Twain wrote Tom Sawyer, but at the same time disbelieve that Sam Clemens wrote it. But Mark Twain is identical to Sam Clemens, so in the scope of that operator, in the scope of belief, I believe Mark Twain wrote Tom Sawyer, but I can disbelieve that Sam Clemens wrote Tom Sawyer, despite that Mark Twain is no other than Sam Clemens. So identity is not, you can't swap identity in the scope of a belief operator. You can't, identical terms don't swap. That's just a fact of intentionality. So the question is truth intentional? That's a great question. Maybe it is. It would be kind of surprising though, because we like to think that things are, if one sentence is true and one sentence is identical to the other, we might wonder, how is it that the other fails to be true? So belief, we can explain how this is true and this isn't, or sorry, we can explain how this is true and this isn't, because the operator reflects some mental state of mind. Truth doesn't reflect some kind of state of mind, it reflects the state of the world. So if the world is such that A is true and A equals B, isn't the world such that B is also true? So going intentional with the truth predicate is a way to block this move, because you deny Leibniz law within the scope of the truth operator. But is that right though? Isn't truth exactly the sort of predicate or exactly the sort of operator that should be extensional? You've got two sentences and they're logically equivalent. You can swap one for the other in the scope of the truth predicate. If we have P is logically equivalent to Q, and it's true that P, what this sentence means is they have the same truth value. So if that's what that means, if equivalence just means it has the same truth value, then shouldn't I be able to swap in the scope of the truth operator? That's all it means. If all equivalence means it has the same truth value, and we identify the truth value of 1 as P, then we should identify the truth value of Q as being true as well. This suggests that truth is extension, because we can swap logically equivalent expressions within the scope. But that's logical equivalence. This is Leibniz law. This is identity. I don't know. Is that a difference? Yes.
Well, what about the bachelor unmarried male
Yep.
case then? So if a bachelor is, intentionally equivalent to an unmarried male and bachelor is an 8-letter word, then it does not follow that an unmarried male is an 8-letter word.
Yeah,
I
that's
think-
right.
I think
So
that-
so there's a predicate is,
I think that
X
it's,
number of letters.
related insofar as you're using quotation in conjunction with Leibniz's law, and that seems to be sort of part of the problem.
maybe. So the problem is the combination of these two things?
The combination of Leibniz's law as you're using it with either quotation or disquotation seems to be the problem, at least it seems to me.
So that might be. But Leibniz law in this case, it's hard to see how we can explain why one would succeed and the other would fail. So I mean, you might be right, that they might not be available in conjunction, but if they're not available in conjunction, why not? Like, what's going wrong here? It's something that needs explanation. It'd be cool, if you could.
Forgive me if I'm completely ignorant about logic, but as a statement is not protracted out as to why we should accept it's true.
You mean
So,
line 8 here?
Yeah, so like you said 6 through 9 are like stuff that is like,
It's in the actual
it's
world.
in the actual world, so what evidence in the actual world leads us to believe that there's unicorns?
There's none.
There's
That's the
none.
problem.
Okay, so then like,
In fact, like,
it doesn't work,
we intentionally selected a false, no sentence that we know to be false. You
okay?
can put any false, that's why it's called the prove anything paradox. Because all you're doing is you're assigning a value to S, and that value that's assigned to it just happens to include the term S. And when you do that, you can put anything you want here. You can say God exists, we could say we're all puking rainbows, whatever. You can put whatever, no matter how ridiculous it is. You can put that in there, follow the same steps of inference, and get it out at the end.
Alright,
That's what's weird about it. So how do I get that S is true here? I got it from 1 and 7. 1 says that S is identical to this string of symbols. I've just shown that that same string of symbols is true, and that should be alone to say, because they're identical, that S is true. So I deduce the truth of S, but it's not something I should be able to deduce.
so it's a logical argument, but it's not really sound because the premises aren't true.
That's the question is which premise is false. There's only one premise here, this one. And then there are a bunch of other rules. So either the premise is bad or the rules are bad. If the premise is bad, why? Here's a bunch of cases where I have self-reference and everything's A-okay. So it's not just because it's self-referential, that's not why it's bad. There's got to be a deeper explanation. Because there's plenty of self-referential sentences that are quite okay. So what is wrong with that sentence? That's the problem. So this is what I've been working on. What is going on with self-reference? How do we separate the good cases of self-reference from the bad cases? So far, I don't know why, I'm still not clear as to why we should consider the Disappearing Act a bad case. I don't know why. That's really what I'm interested in, is why is the sentence, no one knows that what I'm saying now is true. Why is that true? I mean, it's like, why is that, why would that be pathological? Why would that be bad? Like, we know why it's true. Sorry, I shouldn't have said why it's true. We know why it's true because we can deduce it's true. Because if no one knows that what I'm saying now is true, if that sentence were false, then someone would know that what I'm saying now is true, but we just said that what I'm saying now is false. So that's a contradiction. So no one knows that what I'm saying now is true, it has to be true. But I just deduced it. So if I just deduce the truth and no one knows that what I'm saying now is true, then you've deduced something but failed to know it? That seems kind of weird too. But what's wrong with it? There's no contradiction. It's just like a proof. But it's unlike this proof, which gives us ridiculous stuff at the end. My contention, or at least my concern, is that if we're going to classify sentences like no one knows that what I'm saying now is true, or God does not know that most of what Saul says is true, if we're going to classify those as bad sentences, there's got to be a reason that they lead to some kind of paradox. We've got to be able to do something like this. We've got to be able to show that there's some terrible pathological consequence that comes about from allowing that sentence into our language. But I don't know how to do that. And that's really where my reason is, at the very edge of that. You see the problem? It's a cool problem. It's a cool paradox, though, isn't it? It's like you're putting things in boxes and unpacking them and then repacking them and getting something you never would have expected. Yeah, it's the worst Christmas. Well, I guess unicorns exist. That's the best Christmas present ever.
Well, like, whether they exist or not, do you own one?
They don't want to guess. That's the important question.
It's like they could
exist.
Wait, what if we put into that sentence, if this sentence is true, then this sentence is false?
We would get, at the end, this sentence is false, and we would have a contradiction between 8 and 9.
Yeah,
And
that's.
so we'd be able to prove that contradictions are true.
Oh, man. We're into deep.
That's what's weird about it, right? I mean, that's what's completely weird. So I mean, here's the approach to argument. You might be confused if you just walked in and say, like, he's giving me this argument for something I know is false. Is this guy crazy? No, I'm not giving you an argument for the truth of unicorns exist. The prove anything paradox is a paradox. It's not an argument. The point is we're using logic and what we know about logic to go from something that seems to be innocent and uncontroversial to something that is absolutely ridiculous. So I'm not saying this is a good argument. I'm saying this is a bad argument. The question is, why is it bad? If you trace just the standard exercise in basic logic, if a valid argument has a false conclusion, then one of its premises has to be false. Well, this is the only premise, but why the heck is it false? It's false because it leads to something ridiculous. I guess that's one explanation, but it's not a very satisfying one. Just because something leads to ridiculousness doesn't explain why that's good, why that's bad, and this is good, and this is good, and this is good. But they both have the same flavor. I could have said, S equals, S has, well, 22 letters would be false. But still, it's a good sentence. It's just a false sentence in this case. In this case, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Now it's true. So again, it's the same sort of deal. We've got our S equals, here S equals something that seems just fine and innocent and even true. Here, S is something that just it can't possibly be sensible, because I mean, even if we said that this was false, we're going to get the same sort of paradox in the end. Just we go a different route through the logic. Yeah, it's crazy. That's all I wanted to tell you. It's been racking my brain for years. This stuff on the disappearing act is a relative. This came up last winter. So this came up.
Did you come up with this or something?
What, the disappearing act? Yeah, that's mine. So that's mine. Can you prove anything paradox? That's Curry's. The liar paradox. You see that in the Bible, I think. That's a really old one. Yeah, and these over here, these are just standard examples of good cases of self-reference. Yeah, the disappearing act, this one, or whatever's on the handout, that comes from my paper.
I feel like my brain's on like a speedboat, you know? And it's like
Yeah, it's twisty. It's very twisty. But that's the case with any kind of self-referential argument. Any self-referential argument involves thinking about itself, but there are others. Here's a case. Suppose it's called the prediction paradox. Suppose I were to ask you to predict my future behavior, and then by predict and then tell me about it. If you tell me about it, then I can just do the opposite of whatever you predicted, right? So and that's pretty innocent, but here's a logical case. Here's a case where it's strange. Say nothing as a way of representing to me that I will hear you say something.
What?
See, you just failed to represent that I heard you say something because you didn't say nothing. So you weren't on board with my semantic stipulation. But so that's an idea. So say nothing to signify to me that I'll hear you say something. That's incoherent. You can't. That's in itself self-referential, because what you're doing is you're flagging your own lack of a sentence, your own silence, as designating exactly what that silence is preventing. So there's this internal self-defeat there, much like a self-referential paradox. It's not paradoxical, it's just a command you can't possibly follow. So it's a name, or it's a signal for a state of affairs that you can't use, because if you were to use it, you would make it so that the state of affairs didn't exist. The prediction paradox is a similar history. You might think that, for instance, that the laws of physics are deterministic. And if the laws of physics are deterministic, you might imagine that there is a demon. It's called Laplace's demon in philosophy of science. And Laplace's demon is a demon that knows everything there is to know about the initial state of the universe. Laplace's demon also knows all of the deterministic laws of physics. So you would think then that Laplace's demon would be able to predict any future event using their knowledge of the initial state of the universe plus the physical laws. But what happens if there's a counter-predictor? There's another demon that gets wind of the Laplacian demon's prediction and just decides to do the opposite. What happens there? That's a paradox. Because the laws of physics are deterministic. They should fix the future. But if we think that if we allow Laplace's demon to walk around in our world, then it's the same sort of situation that I was suggesting before, that tell me, just give me your prediction and I'm going to do the opposite. There's nothing wrong with that in a normal setting, and there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with that in the Laplacian setting either. If the demon predicts the future using the laws of physics plus their knowledge of the initial state of the universe, but there happens to be a counter-predicting demon, a demon that does whatever the prediction is, the other demon does the opposite, then what does that mean? The laws are wrong? Does that mean that the demon was wrong about the initial state of the universe? No, it doesn't mean that. What it means is that there is a serious problem with representation. There's a serious problem with trying to predict your own prediction. So that the Laplace's demon, if he's inside the universe walking around and is causally related with other objects and people, and demons even, then it seems that in order to predict the future, the demon has to predict their own prediction. And if the demon has to predict their own prediction, we enter into something that's self-referential. So, am I going to predict the very prediction that I'm predicting right now? This is kind of the question that they have to answer. And I don't know, is that even a sensible question? Am I going to predict the very prediction that I will predict? Yeah, am I going to predict the prediction that I make next?
So what if libertarian free will necessarily exists?
So if libertarian free will exists, then this isn't a problem at all, because then the libertarian is going to, so by libertarian, you mean like an agent causation?
Yeah, or event called libertarianism, but just simply the claim that free will is incompatible with determinism and determinism is false.
Yeah, so that would happen. You could think that there's something wrong with the deterministic laws, that try as you might, Laplace's demon, you will not be able to deduce anything about the future, and if you try, I'm just going to show that determinism is false. That is one way of going. So you might take the prediction paradox as an argument against determinism. So why don't I take the disappearing act as an argument against omniscience? Because prediction is a kind of knowing, right? I know the future if I can predict the future. So here we've got a case of God not knowing that most of the sentences are true. So here we've got the self-referential paradox that puts tension on determinism. Here we've got a self-referential paradox that puts pressure on the possibility of omniscience. So we've got another analog. Thanks, Mark. You've given me another analog to put it in the good pile. Not only is it like reasoning from lists, it's also analogous to the prediction paradox. And if the prediction paradox is actually an argument against determinism, here we might have an argument against omniscience. Maybe.
I
I
have
don't suspect.
I have a question. If God says, so going back to the disappearing act.
Yep.
If God makes the claim, his first claim, most of what Saul says today is false. Does that change Saul's kind of two other claims?
What God says?
Yeah.
It shouldn't have any influence on what Saul did. God could have said nothing. He could have just stolen the set of the show and then started to open his mouth as if to say something, and then Saul just right there interrupt and say, "No, you're a big liar. Whatever you're going to say is false."
Right.
And then the same thing happened.
Then there's no more paradox.
Well, no, there's still a paradox because Saul says, "Before you say anything, let me just say what you're about to say is a lie." That's false because God's not a liar. And then the next thing he says, You don't know that most of what I said today is true, maybe anticipating what God was going to say. So the story needs, it's just the way that the story works, that God is the one that introduces the idea that most of what Saul said that day is true. But here's another way of putting the same point. You might just have these three sentences. You might have sentence one, tautologies are true. 2, tautologies are false. Clearly, exactly half of the sentences I've got numbered here are true, exactly half. 3, no omniscient entity knows. That most of my parenthetically numbered, I didn't put parentheses around those, did I? No. No omniscient entity knows that most of my parenthetically numbered sentences are true. Same deal. There's no story, no Saul. Exactly half of these are true. Now let's consider the truth value of this. If this is false, then some omniscient entity knows that most of my parenthetically numbered sentences are true. But if we're imagining that 2 and 3 are false, then that can't be, because most of them are in fact false. It's not the case that most of them are true if we think this is false. So it can't be the case that this is false. So it must be true that no omniscient entity knows that most of my parenthetically numbered sentences are true. But if that's true, then 2 out of the 3 numbered sentences are true, and so most of them are true, and so there's a truth that no omniscient entity knows. So we don't even need the parable. This is actually the tightest way of putting the argument. The parable's a lot of fun. Come on. So this is really the core of the argument. And now you see it, it's obviously like a list. Because no omniscient entity knows that most of the listed sentences here are true, just like this one. So the analogy between these two becomes a little clearer. So is this an argument against the possibility of omniscience? Let me give you another reason to think why. It's not a deductive reason, it's maybe an abductive reason, maybe an inductive reason, I don't know. Sometimes I can't tell the difference. Gödel, I don't know if you heard of this guy. Gödel was this mathematician and logician who was working in the early 20th century. And he came up with this thing called the incompleteness theory. And what he, glossing over all of these technicalities, it's an amazing intellectual achievement, but glossing over all of the subtle parts that make it an achievement, he proved mathematically that there are sentences of mathematics, true sentences of mathematics, of arithmetic, that can't be proven using arithmetic. So, if there are truths that cannot be proven, why is it so surprising to think that there are truths that cannot be known? And here's another little tidbit. Gödel's proof, the proof that there are truths of mathematics that can't be proved, it utilizes self-reference. But the reason that his version of self-reference is acceptable is because he shows how to get it from just a simple numbering sequence. He takes his language and he assigns every symbol in his language a number, then he uses basic arithmetic to show how to encode that sentence using numbers, and he uses another fact about arithmetic to show that that encoding always picks out a unique sentence each and every time. And then by doing that, he explored some number sequences and found a sentence that looked like this. D is true, you can say, if and only if it's not the case that D can be proven. He doesn't write it in English, of course, he writes it in a more obscure jargon. That's the idea. This is the sentence that he shows that this has to be true. That's what he proves. He proves that there is a sentence in any language given enough arithmetic. There's always going to be a sentence that looks like this. So there's truths about mathematics that can't be proven. There's truths about all sorts of number theory, all sorts of areas of mathematics that can't be proven. Just give him a language and give him numbers to represent that language. He'll prove that there is a sentence, and it'll show that that domain of truths, or that domain of things that can be proven, is incomplete. There are truths that fall out, which is weird. It's like truth is a basket, or like, I don't know, reality is a basket, say, and try to put all of the truths in it and all one's always spilling out. Yeah, all of provability, yeah, think of provability as a basket. Every time that you prove something, you throw a truth in the basket, but what this shows is there's always a sentence that you can't put in the basket. That's cool, that's crazy. And that's actually what inspired all of this. That's actually inspired what inspired all of this interest, including improving anything paradox. This Gödel, because this is accepted. This is just, mathematicians just say, yeah, this is one of the greatest achievements in the 20th century, is proving this. But then there's all of this other stuff that's really closely related to it, that people come back, no, it's a liar paradox in disguise. That's usually what I get when I get into the disappearing act. Oh, it's just this in disguise. But it's not clear to me how it could possibly be in disguise. There's no one has ever showed me how this leads to a contradiction like this. It's neat, huh? It's weird. Ideas running over themselves. If you ever get a chance to take a class in advanced logic, once you've gotten there, try to find somebody to teach you Gödel's proof. It is incredible. Just incredible. Other questions? What else do you guys talk about? Anything
Anything and everything, pretty much.
Sometimes we have like open discussion kind of topics, but like more recently, towards the end of the semester and upcoming few weeks, we have a lot of guest speakers, so it's more of us listening.
Awesome.
But
Oh, yeah.
typically it'll be like some of the officers will have a little presentation and like we try to have like discussion-based questions.
Cool.
But thank you so much for being our guest speaker. We really appreciate
Oh,
it.
it's fun. So we're done. Questions, open discussion? Pieces on?
What classes are you teaching next semester? Maybe people can sign up.
In the fall, I will be teaching metametaphysics online. That will be available to on-ground and online students. Metametaphysics being the central question of metametaphysics is metaphysics even possible? Is it possible to answer questions about reality and then actually being true? Is it possible to answer questions about reality and then being known? So some people complain about metaphysics. You're claiming stuff about gunk and atoms and structure and what grounds what. Is there any way for us to know the true value of these claims? That's an epistemic question in metametaphysics. There's also the question of, is it the case that these claims even have a truth value? That's another question in metametaphysics. So are there even facts that we can describe? Carnap says no. Quine says yes. And so we start with the Quine-Carnap debate, go through that very roughly, and show how for 40 years after that, everybody that thought that they understood Quine and Carnap really didn't, and now there are all of these scholarly debates on what they really meant. And recently, Amy Thomason has published a book that is widely thought to be the true heir to Carnap, that she has really captured what Carnap got, that and his anti-realism, this idea that metaphysics is, in some sense, either super easy or impossible. And so she calls her work easy ontology. She thinks it's super easy. It's just a matter of speaking a language correctly and deciding on how to speak a language, and then just living up to the rules that you set down for. So yeah, that's metametaphysics. What else? Probably philosophy of science. Maybe intro ethics. Maybe intro ethics. I'm not sure. No, I think we should do intro ethics. Philosophy of science. Yeah, I can't remember what else. It'll be on the schedule soon enough. Yeah.
I'm sorry, did you say that the metametaphysics course, that's an online seminar?
It's an online seminar, but it's also available to on-ground students.
Cool.
The only problem is, and take it from these guys, it's intense. Because the whole semester is compressed into like 8 weeks, 7.5 weeks. So it's super intense. But if you can read quickly and you don't mind the pressure, you get a really intense half semester with a really lax other half of the semester. Cool. So there is a trade-off. It's intense, but there's a break. Cool. So yeah, I encourage everybody to do it. It's a lot of fun.
Okay.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks again.